Welcome to Coffee with Grant and KZN Top Business. Today we're sitting with Dr. Vilakazi, the new CEO of Ithala. We're currently putting together the KZN Top Business Business Sense newspaper and electronic publication. And in there we've got an article. It's your journey about your 100 days with Ithala as the new CEO. So fill us in a little bit on your journey and how you got to where you are here.
Thank you so much, Grant. It's been 100 days, correct. I actually started here on the 1st of September, so I was warmly welcomed, and it shows that Ithala, a very committed group of people, and in terms of their numbers, and very few staff members, but very focused indeed.
What is your background before you came here? What is your background?
Yeah, I'm born and bred in KwaZulu-Natal. I grew up in the sugarcane fields of Eston, just outside Camperdown. As a little boy, I actually headed cattle and walked most of my time to school, starting chores in the morning in the early 70s. Been fortunate that the community made an opportunity for me to go through to school, starting on the farms, and then I moved to a rural area where my uncle was a paramount chief of a tribe. So I also experienced a lot of traditional aspect of life, Zulu dancing and a whole lot of ceremonies and so on, and actually picked up a few leadership qualities in terms of how you actually manage as a community member. I then, over the years, graduated with a degree in MBA at Henley Business School in London. And I've done other studies, as you might have seen in my credentials. And then recently, up to 2017, I was conferred with a doctorate at UNISA in banking, mergers and acquisitions.
Okay, so the highlights of your career so far?
The way I got into banking was almost mythical. I had an opportunity to meet with Michael Oldwood, who was the former Anglo-American chairman in the late 90s. And he had come to see some projects in KwaZulu-Natal, and I happened to be running one of the projects. And he said to me, "What you're doing here is banking." So he introduced me to a gentleman called Dave Cousins at ABSA, and that's how my story begins in the early 90s, working at Foscas, United, Trust Bank and Allied, and then got promoted to national level. And after that, I also got an opportunity to be posted into America to study advanced banking at JP Morgan Chase in New York, Mellon Bank in Philadelphia, and also spent some time at multilateral institutions. I actually returned a year before 9/11 from the States. Then I joined Standard Bank in Johannesburg, and from there I was then tasked with the responsibility to actually help the Malawian government modernize its banking system. I was actually a deputy CEO of now what is called Standard Bank Malawi, and also helped them to establish and firm up a stock exchange in their country at the time. So that's been my sort of journey where I see myself as a change agent and actually helping and actually make banking to be what it's supposed to be, not to be extractive, but to actually be inclusive and actually give opportunities to people to change their lives.
With that background and where you're going, you sound like the ideal man for the job.
Yeah.
So what have you achieved so far?
I think the first and important thing that I realize is that the communication is quite key. You will notice if you are here that I'm not almost in my office. I still believe in the old models of management by walking around. Mm-hmm. So I've met each and every staff member in this building. I almost know them by their first name. And that for me is quite important, because then you get to hear and get the pulse of the institution of where it is going. We have also been able to have a strategic conversation, which is quite important. And this conversation has actually made people to participate. So rather than just having the board and the ESCO discussing on the strategy, we involve about 50 people from all the lines of management at Ithala for the first time. And we've come up with a strategy that is called Repair, Rebuild and Remodel, which is focusing on repairing what we can at the moment because of the impact of COVID, and rebuilding some of the aspects of our business, so that then we lay a foundation to be able to remodel, so that you can innovate and actually be able to also digitize some of our elements. So that's part of it. The other one is we've already seen results. We returned a profitable month in the month of October for the first time, and for the first time we've actually written assets in excess of 64.5 million, which has never been done in Ithala. On average, they've always been generating about 35 disbursements of loans per month, so we've doubled that within the month. So it tells you that if we can be able to direct the energy that's sitting in the group, that energy can actually be harnessed to actually create a very good organization.
The strategy that you have in place for 2021 with Ithala obtaining a commercial license, maybe you want to expand on that?
Yes, as you know, Grant, for a long time this institution has been operating under the dispensation of what is called the exemption notice, where the minister together with the Reserve Bank authorities grant an institution of this nature an opportunity to be deposit taking and also at the same time lending activities. And this has been happening for over a number of years. However, the intention is for this financial service institution to acquire a fully fledged banking license in terms of Section 12.
What is always worrying me is that, we're not a traditional bank.
Yes.
So you can't apply the same rules.
Now, obviously, when we say state bank, just as a state bank, not necessarily Ithala SOC Limited, it's also going to introduce a different institutional requirement at regulatory level.
Yeah.
And they don't emphasize a lot on the profitability side. So you tend to reinvest your capital and make sure you avail this capital to grow the economy. So it's going to be interesting in terms of certain key indicators and certain key performance indicators that are required. For instance, what level of cost to income ratio a bank like us must really achieve? Is it 55% or is it 65% or 85%? So that then you have that headroom and so on. Do we encourage a state bank to pay dividends, or the state bank must reinvest its capital to actually make sure that it empowers the community? I would argue very strongly that Ithala is well positioned than most analysts might also assume, because at this present moment we're the only ones who can lend and also mobilize deposits, and we are also have prudential requirements that we have to fulfill. The amount of liquid we have to hold, the amount of capital that has to be here, and so on, in terms of all the fundamentals of banking. And so I call ourselves a hybrid. So whilst we are regulated by the Prudential Authority, because we're a state-owned entity, so then you have the PFMA, then you have the Treasury regulations. In order to fulfill that requirements, there are a number of gates that we must go through. One, we must have a proper leadership and the proper people at the top. To an extent that has now been achieved. We have the Chief Risk Officer, we have the Chief Audit Executive Officer here, we have the CEO present, we have anti-money laundering officials that have been appointed, and also the entire assurance team, what we call the assurance team in banking, is there. We also continue to fill a number of key positions, which will then make at the top, that top leadership position is actually able and actually is set. Also at the board level, we now have 7 board members, which is almost the minimum in terms of good corporate governance. So that aspect is almost done. And then the second component that we have to make sure that we are fulfilling is actually around systems. There's been an attempt over the years to roll out a core banking platform. For some reasons or the other, whether those reasons are for capital and also maybe the nature of these projects that require a lot of experience and so on, that we are now have to focus. And to deal with that, I have established a PMO, Project Management Office, that reports directly into the CEO, where we are embedding a culture of project governance in the organization, so that everything that we say is going to happen is measured and is actually tracked, and we're able then to monitor the deliverables and milestones that have been agreed. That will help us in that regard. Processes, there's a certain thing that they look for in the license application. For instance, how we conduct ourselves as a bank in terms of know your client, KYC, anti-money laundering aspects, and so on. So there's a whole lot of work that we've done around what is called the remediation area, where we are able to then take this operation and actually make sure that it's treating the customers fairly, at the same time it's not posing any systematic risk to the banking industry, and it can be trusted by the authorities. Lastly, the issue of capital, which is always a challenge. We're currently speaking to our stakeholders because, as you know, we are directly owned by the province of KwaZulu-Natal, which means there is always a challenge around the fiscus and how much is available for capital. But we have found ways and means of actually talking to our stakeholders at the present moment, where we can begin to maybe relook at how we are structured, and so that then we are able to position ourselves. Grant, I know that there's a debate in the country about the state bank, but I'm telling you, this is the only state bank at the moment, if I may use the word bank, that's been almost in existence for 61 years. However, in various forms or the other, it has not actually been at the stage where it can have a comprehensive banking license, and it offers a very unique product that goes to rural areas, particularly home loans in rural areas, using tribal land, and a number of other products where the commercial banks are actually unable to actually get through in terms of the underbank and the uninsured. We have insurance products that we can offer to our people.
Can I ask a silly question? It might be, but
Yes.
being the state bank and all these years doing it along those lines, if you get the commercial license, won't that change the way things have happened?
Yeah, it always poses a challenge that once you get a license, obviously there's always this emphasis on the profit and the profitability of an entity. However, if you look into what is happening in banking in general, banks for over years, in decades as an industry, have always been almost extractive. For an example, what do I mean by that? For instance, you miss your debit payment, and you genuinely did not have the money to actually cater for that, but you then get penalized. And so there's a bit of an extractive nature of that. So what we're seeing now with the digitalization that's taking place is that there are certain things that we are calling the rush to zero, which means there are certain aspects of services where banks will end up not being able to charge for those. For instance, some of the fees, as you can see, most of the players now are announcing certain fees that are being dropped, which means banks now have to shift and find a way of actually optimizing their balance sheet differently than they have been doing. They can no longer rely on the mistakes or weaknesses of the client who might not be interested in reading the statement, who might also not be actually having good consumer education about what is being offered here. So we see ourselves as continuing in that journey, that even when we do products and value propositions to our clients, that those products must answer and solve societal problems. And if we're able to have propositions that talks to that will actually give us a very unique way. For instance, in the rural areas, if you have a permission to occupy certificate that is issued by an Inkosi or what is called a traditional leader, that we can take as an instrument in this bank and collateralize it and actually give you a loan.
Okay.
And so we're beginning to get into these spaces where the conventional theory says it's impossible to bank, but we're saying you can bank and actually extract and actually create value out of that. We're seeing that market growing, so around the 1 million mark type of a bond and below. Whilst in the old days it was mostly in the traditional so-called traditional market townships, township markets, we're beginning to see that in rural areas where services, because to put up a house, major suburbs in this country like Hillcrest, Kloof and others, they still have a septic tank as a system. So if you can make sure that some of these developments are not going to have an impact ecologically in terms of how you position them, you can actually put up these proper structures and then begin to have an ecosystem. So that's why as a bank, it is very critical for us to introduce those technologies that then makes this community to congregate around this tuck shop, and it becomes. That's how all our towns and cities today started, because our forefathers were traveling and setting up these areas and markets, and so on. So that trend has to continue. Strategy conversation is not the board and ESCO. It's Ithala, and we call ourselves Italians. You know, it might sound Italian, but we see ourselves as a family of these Italians that are here, that are dedicated to serve our community in many ways.
So 100 days, what's the road forward?
This year we've also done a number of initiatives with certain stakeholders. We've just launched a number of agreements with the taxi associations, with technicians. These are so-called bush mechanics that we've actually taken out of their backyards and put them in industrial areas where they're now beginning to actually be seen as formalized businesses. And last week here in this room, we also signed a deal with some cooperatives that are actually have off-take agreements with major retail operators in the country.
Dr. Vilakazi, thank you very much for joining me on Coffee with Grant and KZN Top Business.
Thank you. My pleasure too.
Have you ever heard the words wealth and ordinary South Africans in the same sentence? We are supporting ordinary South Africans in challenging the status quo. It's time to make better, informed choices. Ithala is redefining wealth for ordinary South Africans. So take control of your future and start your journey with Ithala today. Ithala, making it happen together.